Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Boy, with an introduction like that, I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to that, Connie. Thanks so much. I'm going to talk today about something that I accidentally stumbled over in terms of the work that I do as part of being a researcher at The Ohio State University. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail as we move along here, but I'm hoping that this is not going to be as much a lecture as it's going to be a dialogue. So if you participate with me and ask questions along the way, we can make this a dialogue. Otherwise, it will feel a lot more like a lecture. And I have, what, 3.5 hours to do this? So settle in. All right, so I called this the 10,000-foot view on student alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use and abuse because what you're going to hear about is the perceptions of these problems from university presidents and from the city managers of college towns that I interviewed. And I say accidental because when I set out to do this research, I did not have one single question about alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. They brought it up. So that's the context in which I'd like you to listen to what I would like to share with you today. So what I want to do is, for those of you who don't know this, is to bring you up to speed, at least briefly, on the literature on campus community relationships. This is a literature that is still emerging. There are not a whole lot of published studies on this. Unfortunately, until very recently, we've been largely using anecdote in place of data to describe campus community relationships. So, while a good story goes a long way, it's a bad strategy for really knowing something about campus community relationships. So I'm going to talk a little bit about more of that anecdotal information first, and then I'd like to bring you up to speed on some of the things that have been happening a little bit more recently. Then I would like to talk to you about the interviews that I did with the university presidents and the city managers that I was in contact with. And then I would like to present to you a revision of what I have called the 10 TownGown commandments. So these TownGown commandments came out of the interviews that I did. These seem to be 10 recurring themes that university presidents and city managers talked about when they discussed the relationship between the university and the community, the surrounding college town. And there happened to be 10 of them, and I looked at them and I went, oh, 10, isn't that interesting? And they were fairly forceful things that the university presidents and city managers were saying, and so I am just tongue-in-cheek offering them to you as commandments. I think that they're written more in moist clay as opposed to stone tablets, and we can certainly talk about that. But what I did was then, and actually working with Connie Bain, I have begun to revise these to reflect the alcohol issues that are so important to all of you today. And I'm going to force you to discuss things at the end if you refuse to discuss them with me along the way. And again, that's just a reminder, that's permission to raise your hand or blurt things out and get a conversation going. Okay. So, the way that I always talk about campus community relationships is using the metaphor of the glass. Is it half full or is it half empty? If you looked at the research literature, just the entire literature, prior to this decade, you would have gotten some version of this statement, right? So, when you think about campus community relationships, look at the words in yellow. Difficulty, frustration, annoyance, right, for both the town and the university. That's a half-empty perspective, right? And what do you think that's a focus on? Why is it half-empty when people are saying that it's difficulty, frustration, and annoyance? What are they talking about? Alcohol. Student misbehavior. This is the key. This is what everyone focuses on, is student misbehavior. And whether it's caused by alcohol or drugs or anything else, it's what's most readily seen most often by people in the community. The thing that I was really struck with early on when I began going to the International TownGown Association conferences, how many people have ever gone to ITGA? A couple of people in the back, good for you. The rest of you should go. They regularly talk about alcohol and other drug use on campus and really have adopted what Dr. Hingson would call the environmental focus. And we're going to be speaking a lot about that today in my talk. So this is this idea that it's difficult, it's frustrating, it's annoying. That's very different than the glass is half full perspective. And I'm not going to read this all to you other than to say this is my friend Mike Fox, who's a geographer and researcher up in Canada at Mount Allison University. The point here is that if you don't have a college in your community, you wish you did. To just look, for instance, at the last economic downturn, those communities that had some sort of institution of higher learning, whether it was a 2-year or a 4-year granting degree, they did much better economically than the counterpart communities who did not have an institution. So if for no other reason, communities would wish that they would have you in their presence because it's economically sound. In addition, if you talk to many people in the community, they weren't forced there, right? They didn't live there and then all of a sudden a university sprang up. Most people move to college towns because they want the vibrancy of the life that exists there. Of course, many people are moving to college towns because they work there, especially university professors. But when you talk to many people in these residential communities about why they've moved there, they move there for cultural events, they move there because of the athletics, they move there for lots and lots of reasons, which are, I think, glass is half full reasons. Now, I'm going to give you, by the way, a mostly glass is half full perspective today. All right, so here's just one quote to start out. I am going to read this to you because I think it's important. This was one university president I talked to who said, "There's nothing more important than having a great relationship with your city. My belief is this: you can't have a great university and a shoddy city." I love that quote, right? And you can't, in return, have a great city without having a great higher educational system. And this particular president goes on to say then, it's incredibly important to work diligently to ensure that those TownGown relationships are powerful and positive. And so that's my glass is half full perspective that I want to enter into this conversation with you today. All right, so what's the data that I'm going to be presenting to you? This was an initial pass through a much larger data set that I have of presidents and city managers. These were all transcribed interviews, and for those of you who've done qualitative research, you know this is a very laborious process. So I started with these particular 4 university presidents and 4 city managers because they matched up. They matched up well in terms of the size of the university, which was quite large, and the size of the municipality, which was relatively small in comparison to the university. So this is the classic description of the college town. I used a semi-structured interview process with most items focused specifically on TownGown, or if that's an unfamiliar term to you, campus-community relationships. As I noted at the beginning of my talk, I had no items that specifically addressed any alcohol, tobacco, or other drug issues. And yet, throughout the interviews, almost no matter what question I had raised, the topic of alcohol and other drugs came up. This was especially true, however, when I talked to the presidents about either the current problems that they were experiencing and/or the regrets and shortcomings that they had about their tenure as university presidents and/or as city managers. So I want to start out with the first quote. I won't read the whole long quote, but it's there for you, but I do want to read to you what's in yellow. When you have problems with the town, it's not usually because of the faculty or the staff. It's because of student misbehavior. This gets back directly to what I talked about. Remember now, this is a city manager looking at the campus. This particular individual is saying it's not any other issue, it's student misbehavior. And in large part, as you'll see as we go on, it's really mostly about alcohol. In reply to these kinds of issues, university presidents, your presidents, are painfully aware of this. The sympathy that's expressed in this quote, I think, runs across what most university, if not all university presidents, are thinking about. And again, look at the emphasis on the alcohol at the end. You know, when you have 20,000, these are large universities that I tapped into, 20,000 18 to 21-year-olds in one area and they get alcohol, it's very difficult to stop that from happening. So part of this clearly is, the point that I want to make here is when you think about the relationships between your campus and your surrounding communities, know that your city managers, or if you're not in a city manager framework, if it's a mayoral one, a city council one, they're all painfully aware of what your students are doing as a result of their consumption of alcohol. And in fact, it's the number one thing that they see, absent any other information that you're providing to them about your students. But also, I think it's really important, before we move on, to instill in all of you that your university presidents are in fact very conscious of this. And I think that you might be, at least in some cases, to be surprised to find out how knowledgeable they are about this issue and how open they are to potential solutions. And as we will continue to go on throughout my presentation today, it's imperative for you to understand that if you don't have buy-in from the top for what you're doing, and I mean explicit buy-in, if your university presidents and city managers are not on board and do not know about what you're doing and or do not believe that it's important or as important as fill in the blank, your efforts are going to be very, very difficult to accomplish at best, and probably marginally effective over the long run. The other thing I'll just note anecdotally is you also have to pay attention to transitions in leadership. And so while you may have had, for instance, a really strong advocate and someone who was buying into the alcohol prevention efforts, just as an example of what you might have been doing, when you have a turnover at the top and you have a new university president who comes in, you can't just automatically assume that that president's going to endorse everything that you've been doing. And in fact, it's almost as if you have to become deeply suspicious about that individual wanting to do what their predecessor had done. We've seen that here at The Ohio State University as we've made transitions over the years. I've seen, in 25 years of being here, 6, I think, university presidents. And every time a new president comes in, guess what? There's a whole new agenda. And so being able to stay on that president's radar is extremely important. And I cannot underscore this enough. You cannot make the automatic assumption that just because you had the support in a previous administration that you're going to get it in a new administration. And also, if you are working on specific campus community issues and the city manager turns over, or the mayor turns over, or members of city council turn over, you likewise cannot automatically assume that you're going to have that support. All right, I've probably beat that idea enough. You understand what I'm saying. There was a lot of heads nodding too while I was doing that. Okay. All right, just a couple more quotes before I move us forward that I wanted to point out. Look at how this university president is thinking about alcohol use. I guess the most tedious thing has to do with how you handle student alcohol consumption. Tedious. Is that a bright and shiny word? No. So this is tedious. This is like we're back to annoying, right? This is like, oh, God. I'm not going to paraphrase university presidents that I've interviewed. If I have to hear about alcohol consumption one more time, my head is going to explode. That kind of thing, right? So for university presidents, this is why I'm trying to draw some distinctions here for you. They may be very aware, but they may also be very frustrated. They may not know about, as a for instance, all the great things that you're doing. They may only know about the headline, right? Which was happening today, right when you happened to have a meeting with them, right? Talk about bad timing. And someone was arrested or someone died. These are things, and again, that's why I highlighted the bottom part of this, which is it's hard to think about tedious when people are dying, right? And yet on some college campuses, because of the amount of deaths that have occurred over periods of time, like everything else, we tend to start to become immune to the automatic, horrific response that we will have the first couple of times it happens. And so when you see longer-term presidents, or even presidents who have been in multiple institutions, they've been around the block, right? They've heard all of this, they've seen all this, they've witnessed all this. They've been yelled at by people in the community. And so they are going to be a little bit weary and a little bit wary of some of the things that you're doing. And so again, high sensitivity, but they're also going to be very guarded in how optimistic they're going to be at times about the work that you're doing. And then again, now we go on to the opposite side of this, the city manager piece. So the city managers, they've got a tough row to hoe. They're trying to deal with a lot, and in fact, one city manager talked about feeling like they were in the middle of a fulcrum. That on the one side, they had the university yapping at them all the time about the things that they needed from the town. And on the other hand, the city manager felt like they had the people of the community in their ear yapping about all the horrible things that were going on because of the students in the university. And so oftentimes city managers feel besieged. They feel as if they're between a rock and a hard place, trying to deal with their constituents in the community on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to work as best as they can with the university administration. So this is just one particular, for instance, of talking to city managers about their dealings with the business community, and in particular, this one city manager honed in on the bar owners. And what he's pointing out in this particular quote is that they ended up having to really strong-arm these bar owners because, of course, bar owners have a vested interest in selling as much alcohol as possible, right? It's not unlike anything else. More alcohol sales equals more profit. So the question is how you get them to become more responsible about their business practices. And I'm not talking about just not selling to underage consumers. I'm talking about also monitoring alcohol use in the bars, monitoring sales, and so on. So in this particular case, they played hardball. And they talked about how bar owners came to the table, but not willingly. They were arm twisted. And so at times, you would think that you would just get people to go along with things because it was the right thing to do. And over again, this is just one example of where city managers in particular had to play the bad guy. And they had to, especially around alcohol issues and getting their arms wrapped around the issue, they had to be very forceful in how they dealt with the bar owners in the town. Okay, I'm going to make a transition from this. Any comments, questions, or yes, in the back?
Do you get the sense that these administrators, collegiate and city, are more concerned about collegiate drinking as the problem, or the drinking some collegians do as the problem?
So the question is, if I understand it correctly, are they more concerned about I'm going to go backwards, the collegiate drinking, so who's doing the drinking versus is it where they're drinking? Is that the question?
Do they see collegiate drinking in general as the problem, or the drinking that some collegians do, realizing that some are rather moderate in their use, and just a relatively small group who are contributing to the majority of the problem?
I see. Okay. So the answer is, I won't have to repeat that. I'll tell you the answer to the question of what are they most concerned about. They're concerned about headlines. For city managers, it's all about the perceptions of how wonderful it is to live in the community. And so when you get headlines that students are vomiting, urinating in yards, dying because of their behaviors, that's bad for the image of the town. And I think that, to be fair to the university presidents, they do care very much about the health and well-being of all of their students. But I think that most university presidents assign that responsibility to the director of student life. This shouldn't be something that's coming to me as a university president, and I think therefore the headlines again become that irritant of somehow someone wasn't doing their job. So, again, that's not to pick on city managers and say they don't care about human life either, but I think that if you're asking a bottom line question, that's the answer to that question. Did I answer it? Okay, sorry, it's not a pleasant answer. Anything else? Other questions? Or reactions? Okay, you're either bored or you're on your phones or I'm making sense. I'll choose I'm making sense. All right. All right, so I wrote this book. Connie was kind enough to tell you about it, called The Optimal TownGown Marriage. And again, I take this viewpoint because I am, by training, a marriage and family therapist, even though for the last 5.5 years I've been the dean and director of one of Ohio State's regional campuses, which is Mansfield, which is about halfway between Columbus and Cleveland. Anyone ever been to Mansfield? Hey, all right, lots of people have been to Mansfield. All right, so I wrote this book as a reaction to the first 3.5 years of my life on the Mansfield campus because I spent 20 years on the Columbus campus before I took this job. And for those of you who know anything about Ohio State, if nothing else, we're Buckeye Nation, and you go around the country and we have 500,000 alumni, and you say OH, and everybody else says? Oh. Right, so there's such a feeling of goodwill. And so I thought when I took the job in Mansfield, I thought there was going to be this goodwill. And I was going to walk in and I was going to say OH and everybody else was going to say IO, and then I was going to be able to go about my business. And that wasn't what happened. And it was for a number of different reasons, but Mansfield's very different than Columbus. So the Columbus campus we have 85,000 people on campus at any moment. And it exists in a city of 1.5 million, give or take, depending on where you draw the metro boundary. That's a big university in a very big city, 15th largest in America. Now you go to the Ohio State Mansfield, and we have a co-located technical college, so we get to cheat a little bit, and we say we have 5,000 people on campus, but we're surrounded by a municipality that is roughly 50,000. So on the one hand, we're a bigger deal, but we're a smaller big fish in a smaller small town, right? So like many other smaller town politics, what we do tends to matter a lot more. And there were a series of things that had happened on my campus and in interaction between my faculty and previous administrations in the town that left, at best, a distaste in people's mouths. And I found out about that really quickly. Now, I'm only telling you this because I'm trying to give you a rationale for why I see everything in relationship terms. I was on the phone one day as I was trying to recover some of the information I needed about how to fix this relationship between my campus and the community. And I'm on the phone with a huge benefactor. In fact, this particular gentleman had given more money to our campus than probably the rest of the community combined. And he was reading me the riot act. And he was yelling at me about all this stuff that had gone on 15 years ago. And so, marriage and family therapist, I have my clinical hat on, I'm listening, I'm saying, I hear you, right? And he gets to the end and he's exhausted and he goes, well, thanks for listening. And I'm sure this will never happen in your administration, blah, blah, blah. And I say, well, thank you very much for letting me know. I hang up, and I'm on my way home, and I'm like, all right, where have I heard this before? This just felt like such a deja vu experience. And then I thought, oh my goodness, I remember there was this guy that I had seen in marriage counseling, and he was yelling at his wife for something that had happened prior to their relationship. I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? TownGown relationships are like marriages. And I went, wait a second. Hey, I think I've got something here. And it changed my whole focus on how I was going to deal with my partners in the community, because not unlike a marriage, right? It's all about what you're doing right now. I mean, you get to put stuff in the bank, right? Like, and I know, I mean, the reason I have such a great marriage is I know that the term that I use is yes, dear, right? So we learn patterns of interaction, and these are things that work really well. Well, I was searching for the yes, dear for my campus community relationship over time. So part of what ended up happening was my paying more attention then to these campus community relationships in ways in which I began to see it through the lens of more of a clinical focus. And so, again, I give you these TownGown 10 commandments from the standpoint of someone with a marriage and family therapy background, listening to presidents and city managers talk about each other in ways that I think are remarkably similar to how spouses talk to one another. So let's see what you think. All right, so everything in regular type is the actual commandment that comes from my book. The italics are the add-on from the alcohol, tobacco, and other drug perspective. So, thou shalt give high priority to efforts that build more harmonious relationships between campus and community members before the next alcohol-fueled event becomes the focal point of a crisis situation. So, it's really bad business practice to walk up to your partner, really, really bad marital practice to go to your spouse and say, hey, let's fix this because we're in the middle of a fight. Right? That's not the time to be strengthening your marriage. Right? You're in crisis mode. Somebody has done something that's done somebody wrong. Sounds like a country and western song, doesn't it? And you have to figure that out first, right? There's a whole healing process that has to occur. When you hit the headlines, if you're hitting headlines because of alcohol problems or some other student misbehavior, this is not the time to approach the community and say, hey, I'd really like to work with you on alcohol prevention. So that's first and foremost. My hope is that you will take, if nothing else, this back, and you will be in a non-crisis situation, and you will approach potential members of the community and say, we're doing these alcohol prevention efforts, and we'd like to have you become a partner in this process, but not doing it in the midst of a crisis. Okay, that kind of makes sense to all of you, I can tell. Second, thou shalt not miscalculate the time involved in developing and maintaining harmonious campus community relationships, nor shall you restrict your attention to alcohol and other drug issues only. So this is to say that while it would be really great for all of you to go and seek partners in the community about the alcohol prevention efforts that you want to undertake, it shouldn't be the only thing that you're doing with them, right? Because they're concerned, while they're concerned, they'll be very happy to hear that you're going to be doing things to reduce the amount of urination in their lawns and beer cans and so on, right? They will then automatically see you as an ambassador from the university, and they will want to talk about other things. Now, just to warn you, city managers think more about the fact that your universities are nonprofits and don't pay taxes. That's what's on their mind past the alcohol issues. And the next thing that they're just as tuned into is if your university is expanding, you're doing land use planning, and whether or not you've involved the community in that is a really big predictor of how wonderful that relationship is. Likely as not, your universities are going to communities with a plan already in hand, and they're simply informing them. Now, that's bad business practice for any sort of endeavor, but it's particularly bad when you combine it with the previous item that I talked about, because if you're acquiring more land, guess what that means? That's more land that's not taxed. And so this is a big issue. So that's not the only other set of things that they're going to be bringing up, but beware that if you're approaching the community, they're going to want to talk about a lot more than just alcohol use. All right, so now, by the way, I've highlighted the word harmonious here. I thought I would go into that a little bit more so that you would understand this. This is a paper that I published back in 2014. It's in a journal called Innovative Higher Education. And by the way, anything and everything that I talk about is coming from an article, if not my book. And so if you write to me, and I think my email is at the end of this, I'd be more than happy to send you any or all of these papers. So this first paper was a theoretical paper, although it contained 4 case studies. And it talked about these 4 different types. And I use the typology here where I'm relying on 2 primary dimensions. And again, now think back to, for those of you who are married or involved in intimate relationships right now, I think I could boil down your relationship to 2 dimensions. How much effort you're putting in and how comfortable you are. Think about that for a second. So, now you're all thinking about your relationships, right? You've got your loved one in mind. You want to be in a high effort, high comfort relationship, right? I'm not going to ask how many people are actually in that kind of relationship right now. But that's the harmonious one, right? That's what everyone aspires to. Now in this paper, by the way, we supposedly had 1 person coming from South Carolina. I was assuming it would have been from Clemson. Did the South Carolina person come yet? So Clemson is the example in the paper of the harmonious relationship. And it has been the #1 TownGown relationship as, according to Princeton Review, I think for the last 7 years running. And I went to Clemson, actually a couple of years ago, and I have drank the Kool-Aid. They are a harmonious relationship. There is lots and lots of effort that is undertaken between the campus and the community to connect. They have a TownGown council in which a high-ranking official from the university who reports directly to the president sits on, along with their chief of police. And in turn, the town manager, the city manager, and the mayor both sit along with other people. So it's a very high effort, and they're very comfortable with one another. So it's a great place. If you haven't visited it, go visit it. And it's a great example of it. So everyone wants to be Clemson. That's the way that I kind of look at it. Everyone wants to be Clemson. Okay, so now you can have high effort, but you can also have low comfort. That's the conflicted relationship, right? So that's the one where you're putting a lot of effort in, but what you're doing is fighting. And what happens over time, and by the way, it's no different in a marriage than it is in a campus community relationship. Over time, the conflict becomes habitual. Sometimes you end up thinking, it doesn't matter if you're talking about TownGown or marriage here, sometimes you even forget what you're fighting about. You're just fighting, just for fighting's sake. That's the conflicted relationship. And when you start to look at student misbehavior, land use, and the tax issue, that's why you normally and typically will end up in the conflicted area. It's usually because of one of those 3 issues. On the other hand, and by the way, this next one, which is lower effort but high comfort, that's the traditional relationship. Now, let's go back to marriage for a second. For those of you who are old enough to remember the Dick Van Dyke Show. Who remembers the Dick Van Dyke Show? Okay, Rob and Laura Petrie slept in separate beds. You remember that? So it's like that separate but equal. Like, you have a life, I think, and I do, certainly, and we seem to be getting along okay. It's okay. But it's okay as long as I can ignore what you're doing and you're ignoring what I'm doing. Now, that is called the traditional relationship because it used to be the way most campuses and communities operated with one another. That's a luxury that most campuses and communities don't have anymore. They can't ignore each other so much anymore. And a large part of it is because of the economic drivers, but the student misbehavior becomes a big part of that and other things. So I think that's a vanishing species. I think sometimes people want to pretend like they're in a traditional relationship, but oftentimes it's because they're in a lull. They're just tired of fighting with one another. And they've kind of gone into a lull. And then the worst of all the situations, to just round this out, is the devitalized relationship. That's the one I see, Donna Height. That's my student life director right there. That's the one I inherited. So this was the one where we had low effort and low comfort. Why? Because they just quit dealing with one another. Now, the interesting thing about campus-community relationships, the one thing that makes them different than marriages is you can't get a divorce. You can ignore each other really, really hard, right? But you can't get a divorce, right? Other than the very, very few universities that have picked up and left, they've picked up but they didn't go anywhere, right? They disassembled, right? They've ceased to exist. Universities don't pick up and leave, and communities, as much as they might want to sometimes, can't leave the university. So you're stuck with one another, right? But you can get to the point of where you absolutely don't do anything with one another. And in fact, you're trying desperately to ignore the other person, at the peril, though, of a lot of other things that are going on. So that's what I inherited. Okay, so now, thinking that, and I don't know if this is worth doing it, how many people feel like their campus and community are in a devitalized relationship right now? Okay, no one will admit it anyway. All right, I was the only one. All right, how about a traditional? You're ignoring each other. Couple, conflicted. Okay, about third, and then harmonious? Okay. So it's a kind of an even split amongst all of them except the devitalized. That's interesting. So here's the next thing that I'm going to tell you. You're all university people, right? Anybody not a university person here? So you're all, one person in the back is not a university person. You're the only person exempted from this statement. So when I did the pilot on the University of Mansfield campus, one of the things that we found out, which is not extraordinary in hindsight, is my faculty and staff rate the relationship with the community so much higher than the people in the community do. So whatever you think, just subtract 50%, and that's what your people in the community think. Now that's not actually surprising, right? Because you're all half full people anyway, right? You're always trying to see the best, and you don't always see the day-to-day grind that the community members see at the same time. So I just caution you about where you think you are, and that leads to some of the other work that I'll just mention, which is we actually can help you measure those kinds of things. We've developed scales that can help you to understand the amount of effort and the amount of comfort that your community members see in relation to what you yourselves are experiencing on your campuses. Okay. So now you have a little idea about the harmonious relationship. Back to my commandments. Connie, how am I doing with time?
20 minutes.
I have 20 minutes? Okay. All right, thank you. So, thou shalt honor your campus and community partners and seek coalitions across a wide town and gown spectrum. Okay, so what do I mean about honor your campus and community partners? In most instances, your university's budget dwarfs that of the community. So here at The Ohio State University, we are a $5 billion operation. And I think last we looked, the city of Columbus, anybody from the city of Columbus here? No. Okay. It's less than $1 billion. That's the total operation for the entire city of Columbus, less than $1 billion. And yet, on our little patch of land, we're a $5 billion operation. Most other universities follow a similar pattern. So you have a lot more money, you have a lot more resource than your community does. And they're very aware of that. And that makes for a very uneven playing field. What tends to happen in those situations is that the university then acts like the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? We've got all the money, we've got all the resources, and that's how they act. The smartest and I think most agile presidents flatten that playing field. No matter how disparate the budget is, they treat their city partners as equals. That's critical. And so that's the piece about the honor your partner, but then also seeking a coalition across a wide spectrum. So recognizing that if you're going to undertake alcohol prevention efforts, you need the business community to be involved. You also need the clergy to be involved. You need nonprofits to be involved, and so on. So you want to build as large a spectrum as you possibly can in these efforts. And again, it's because you will also then be very well positioned to do the other work that your community partners will be asking you to do. All right, so just a brief hiatus here to tell you a little bit about another article that we wrote in terms of how you can begin to think about this kind of work in terms of creating good campus community partnerships. The first part is actually, and this is a circle, but I'm going to punctuate it at the top here, awareness raising. So whether or not you want to be more specific about alcohol issues, or if you want to more generally approach this in terms of, hey, we as a university want to be better partners with you, there needs to be that awareness raising on both sides, both the campus and the community. So being able to approach your faculty senate, letting them know. Student organizations are a critical component of this on the campus side. Getting involved with alumni associations. Those are all good awareness-raising efforts on the campus side, and then hitting all of those partnerships in the community. For Mansfield, just to give you an example, we place students in 3 primary areas. We have a business and industry internship program, so we wanted to contact the business community very specifically, and that was through the Chamber of Commerce. We also have a teacher preparation program, and so we wanted to contact all of the local school districts. And so we went through the superintendent's offices. And then we also have a very large nonprofit internship and co-op experience, and so we wanted to go through the nonprofit organizations, and that meant the United Way. So for us, those were the 3 primary partners that we then began to do coalition building around. Now, this is really important if you're going to do any kind of data gathering, the way that I'm suggesting, right? Stop thinking anecdote and start thinking actual data. Those coalition partners won't just be helping you in terms of building an understanding of why all this is important. They also will be there to help you gather data. So if you want to get the perspectives of community members, this was something we did again in Mansfield. So the Chamber of Commerce sent out an email to all 275 of their members and asked them to participate in the survey. Likewise, the United Way sent it out to all of the agencies and organizations that they funded, as well as their benefactors, and so on. So this is a way of not only building coalitions, it's also a way of then increasing the reliability and validity of your data. Okay, so you gather some kind of data. That's great, but you then still need to figure out what you're going to do with that data, especially if you're going to become more data-informed or data-driven in your practice. And so that means being able to have people on hand to interpret that information. Most of you, certainly Ohio State's is really well positioned to be able to use that kind of data through the institutional data management that we have. But then it's also meeting back with your community partners and beginning to build a rationale for where you're going to go next. Creating a vision statement, if you will, about what does all of this data mean and where is it supposed to take you. All right, TownGown commandment number 4. First part, standard part, thou shalt seek win-win outcomes wherever and whenever possible in campus community interactions. And then to the specific point here, remembering that both campus and community leadership must be fully engaged when it comes to prevention and intervention efforts. There's an old Italian saying that a fish rots from its head down. So take that as you will. TownGown commandment number 5, thou shalt remember that students are the most important connection between campus and community. And this is critical. 100 acts of preventative kindness cannot erase a crisis event, but it certainly creates the more balanced viewpoint. If there are no other stories to tell in your community, other than what hits the headlines about your students, you're sunk, right? You're going to be driven entirely by the headlines. If you instead are out talking about the 100 acts of kindness, the 1,000 hours, the 100,000 hours, we did, what, Connie, 1 million hours of community service last year, according to Dr. J. Those are stories that you have to tell and continue to tell. that your students are out doing all of these other wonderful things. Now, to just drive home this point about how important students are in the eyes of the community, we, the Mansfield campus until very recently, have been largely a commuter campus. And yet, when we looked at the data over and over again, community members pointed out that they saw us largely through the eyes of the students that they interacted with. Which is really important for someone, a senior administrator like myself, because it tells me what I say is not as important unless and until I have students standing with me and telling the stories that they can tell about what they're doing. So also don't rely on yourselves. In fact, I've learned this after 5.5 years of fundraising. I mean, actually, I don't have to say anything if I bring a student with me. The student tells the story. The student sells whatever it is that we're attempting to get the funds for. And it happens so much more easily because the community members, the people who are going to fund these operations, they want to hear from the students themselves. So your most powerful allies in telling the good stories about what your students are doing are the students themselves. All right, we've done the first 5. Now we're halfway through. Commandment number 6, thou shalt know the power of your alumni, especially those living in the communities immediately surrounding the campus, and those who are participating in alcohol-involved activities. They are the ones who hold the institutional memory about appropriate and inappropriate party behavior. I was a member of a fraternity when I was at Penn State. Do we have any Penn State people here? Okay, so I was a member of a fraternity on South Allen Street, Phi Sigma Kappa, and I went back up, so that was a long time ago. I won't tell you how long ago. It was a long time ago, but I keep going back because we do a charity golf tournament every year. So I went this past year and met some of the new brothers as well as the chapter advisor. And I was telling them about how impressed I was with the things that State College and Penn State were doing around alcohol consumption. They just won an award, this was last year, from the International TownGown Association Conference for having stemmed what was called State Patties Day. You familiar with that? Right? So, like, this was mayhem, right? I mean, just St. Patrick's Day craziness. And that didn't even exist when I was in school. So this was somehow something that had evolved over time. So anyway, I'm telling all of these folks about how impressed I am with all of the things that are going on in State College and with the Penn State campus. And these people had no idea what I was talking about. They were in their own little enclave. They had never had any contact with any of the prevention or intervention efforts. I know there's someone who's going to be talking about Greek life later today. There was just no connection with at least my fraternity. Not to say I'm not casting stones that they weren't trying to work with Greek organizations, but it never trickled down. None of the current membership there had heard anything about it. But all of the guys who had graduated 3, 5, and 10 years ago were there to talk about how wild all the parties were, right? So I just simply draw you into this idea that the alumni, especially the immediate alumni, who are passing on the knowledge, the institutional knowledge of how to party, where to party, when to party, right? What the acceptable and unacceptable bounds are. They're key to your efforts. It's not just the current students, it's the students who have just graduated and are still living in the community. They're just as important, if not more important, to your efforts because they drive a lot of this through the stories that they tell. And I witnessed this again firsthand when I was back in State College a month ago. Commandment number 7, thou shalt respect the notion that faculty members represent the face of both campus and community. Let me just pause right there. Most faculty do live in the community. Do we have any faculty here? Okay, a couple of you. You live in the community, right? Yeah. So you have 2 hats, right? On the one hand, if you go to community things, you're seen as an ambassador from the university. They want to know, right? They're going to pick your brains. Hey, what does your president think? And, right? And why do you pay your football coach so much money? That's the question I hear constantly. In fact, that's the single biggest reason why I can't raise funds as well as I would like to on the Mansfield campus. It's because why don't you just ask your $8 million football coach for some money? Anyway, So faculty members in general wear both hats, but now finish the sentence, and they are the ones who see students both before and after the parties. Now, we've tried to bring our faculty in to a lot of the different efforts that we've undertaken, right, Donna, as part of our student life efforts. And it's easier for us because we're a small campus. We have 40 full-time tenure-track faculty members and 20 full-time non-tenure-track faculty members, so 60 of them. And I'd say we probably have most of them participating in most of the activities. Do you think that's fair to say? In a larger campus, which I know many of you represent, I think you're probably looking more at like a third, a third, and a third. So there's a good news, bad news thing. So a third of them, I can just tell you out of hand, they're not even going to listen to you. They won't open your emails. They're too busy doing the stuff that they're doing. But there's another third that if you're not already tapping into them, they're there. They really do want to help. They want to be a part of things that will help students and student life. So ask them. And then that's the really good news, right? But then the semi-good news is you've got a whole other third sitting in the middle that could be swayed either way. And so part of what faculty are notoriously good at doing is giving each other peer pressure. And so you can get some very involved faculty members who then can pull some of the less involved faculty members into some of these efforts as well. And so again, right in the classroom is where some of these prevention and intervention efforts can be taking place. We're certainly doing a lot of Title IX work around that right now, and I think that that can be extended easily to alcohol and other drug work. Commandment number 8, thou shalt appreciate the history of campus community relationships that you've inherited, including all lore about party-related activities, right? So we're currently dealing here at Ohio State with the Mirror Lake jump that we do. People familiar with that? So right before the Michigan game, we have students who jump into Mirror Lake, and we just had a student die as a result of that. Landed on his head. Was inebriated, very high alcohol level. That's not a tradition that stems back any further than, what, Connie, 1989? No, 98. So, I mean, but yet, all of the students right now and the ones who've gone through say that's a tradition. Well, okay, it's a tradition for everyone from 1998 on. So how do you stop that tradition? That's really the important part, which is no different than any other party-related activities, right? You have to stop it at some point. It has to cease becoming a tradition. It has to be replaced by other traditions. But you would be foolish to discount the tradition. You would be foolish and naive to simply think that that history doesn't exist. It's very powerful. Commandment number 9, thou shalt continuously assess, and there's my little thing. If you want to go learn more about assessment, you can go to collegetownassessment.com. We've got lots of resources there for you. You should be assessing the present state of your relationship, and that the general attitudes toward each other, meaning general attitudes between campus and community partners, are going to determine, they will drive the specific ways in which you and your community partners will interact around alcohol and other drug issues. So it's all part of one big package, right? So if you have a great relationship right now, you're in a great position to do something around alcohol with your community. If your campus community relationship is not so good right now, you're going to have a tough row to hoe. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but what it probably means is, what it likely means, not probably, is that you're going to have to work just as hard on the generic campus community issues as you are on alcohol issues more specifically. And then 10th and finally, this is the Boy Scout motto, right? You should leave the campus and community relationship in better shape than you found it. And I think, and this is again the glass half full piece of this, you can make a difference in teaching college students how to have fun in more responsible and safe ways. And I want to conclude and then open up to discussion with another quote from another university president. This is one that I really love. People have talked about working hard and playing hard as a student. I want to talk about working smart and playing smart. The smart part is that we want to recognize our students as adults and give them the immense responsibility of refining their own culture, rather than treating them as kids. And I think that that is a huge paradigm shift. We have too often been involved in what I call the parents patre way of dealing with this, right? You all inevitably end up getting put into positions where it starts to look like your mom and dad. If you're actually mom and dad aren't doing the mom and dad coaching that they need to be from however far away they are, this isn't going to work, right? They need to be treated as adults and treated as adults in ways in which they're empowered to then, as again the university president goes on, to become more effectively engaged and understand the responsibilities that they actually have. With that, I'll open it up to questions or comments that people have.
Maybe for 2 questions.
2 questions, Connie says. So, golden question number 1.
This remark about they had to come with arm twisting. I'm all for it. What is it? What's arm twisting?
So in the case, the question is, what was the arm twisting back on the city manager quote about the bar owners? So what this particular city manager said to the bar owners, and he had called them all into city council, and he said, look, he said, we're about to undergo a brand new initiative, and it's going to require you to do the following things. You can either do them, and we will know that you're doing them, or the next time that there is something that happens in your bar, we're going to treat you differently than the people who are in the coalition. And so that meant everything from you were going to see police actions in ways in which they were heretofore not being treated, or that they were going to be treated more harshly, as well as having their liquor licenses brought up for review quicker, and other things like that. So it was they were saying, look, it's a carrot and a stick. If you're with us, we're going to give you a lot of carrots. If you don't do these things, we're going to whack you with this stick as hard as we can. Now again, it's only with the powers that a city manager has in city council, but they were dead serious about it, and there was only actually, in this particular instance, because I kind of probed further in my interview, they had only one bar owner that did not go along with what they had wanted to do. That bar was shut down within 3 months. So then that became very telling to the other bar owners. One other question? No? Okay, well then thank you very much for listening to me, and enjoy the rest of your conference.